Imagine trying to build an army without standing troops, uniforms, or steady pay. Medieval kings did just that, piecing together forces with oaths, gold, and faith. But what truly kept men marching into war? Medieval kings didn't wake up and casually decided to invade France over breakfast. War wasn't some spur-of-the-moment thing. It required one specific person's stamp of approval, and that person held all the cards. Only the king could legally declare war and start a military campaign. Nobody else had that authority, not even the most powerful nobles or church leaders. But here's where it gets interesting. Kings didn't just announce their war plans to everyone like some medieval Twitter announcement. They often kept their intentions secret, choosing very carefully who to tell and when to act. Smart rulers knew that loose lips could warn enemies or give rivals time to prepare countermoves. The element of surprise was everything. Most medieval kingdoms had zero standing armies. None. Kings didn't maintain thousands of soldiers sitting around eating royal food and getting paid year-round. Instead, they built armies from scratch every single time they wanted to fight. Think about how wild that is. Every war meant starting completely over with recruitment, training, and organization. The closest thing to regular troops were the king's personal household knights. These guys lived at court, trained constantly, and stayed loyal because their entire livelihood depended on royal favor. They formed the core of any army, but even the richest kings only had a few hundred of these professional warriors at most. When a king decided to go to war, he'd set ambitious targets for troop numbers and fire off orders to local lords and officials across his kingdom. These weren't polite requests. They were royal commands backed by serious consequences for anyone who ignored them. Lords received specific quotas. Send me 50 knights and 200 foot soldiers by Easter, or else. Well, the or else part varied depending on the king's personality and how desperate he was for troops. Some rulers threatened to seize lands, others imposed crushing fines, and a few simply showed up with their existing army to convince reluctant nobles to cooperate. The whole system moved slower than molasses in winter. Gathering an army could take months, especially if lords lived far from the capital or if harvest season interfered with recruitment timing. Kings learned to plan campaigns around agricultural cycles because trying to pull farmers away during planting or harvest was like asking for a peasant revolt. Medieval warfare wasn't just about having the biggest army, it was about convincing the right people to show up in the first place. But getting those people to actually appear with their weapons and troops, that required understanding a complex web of obligations, bribes, and threats that stretched across the entire kingdom. Once the king made his decision, he couldn't just snap his fingers and summon an army out of thin air. Medieval Europe ran on a system called feudalism, and this is where things get interesting. Land-owning nobles didn't just get their fancy estates for free, they owed the king military service in return. Think of it as the world's most expensive rent payment, except instead of money, you paid with knights and the promise to show up when war came knocking. Knights weren't just random guys who picked up swords one day. These warriors trained from childhood, spending years mastering swords, learning to fight on horseback, and getting comfortable in heavy armor that weighed as much as a small person. Their entire social status revolved around their ability to kill people professionally. Pretty intense career path, right? When a lord received the king's summons, he'd gather his own armed men. Some brought small groups of 5 or 10 fighters. Others showed up with hundreds of soldiers trailing behind them. The size of your entourage basically announced how important and wealthy you were. But here's the weird part. Each knight's service typically lasted only about 40 days before they could negotiate for payment or find ways to get out of further duty. This 40-day rule created massive headaches for medieval kings. Just when you're getting your army organized and ready to fight, half your knights start checking their calendars and announcing they've fulfilled their obligations. Sorry, Your Majesty, but my contract is up. Time to go home and tend to my lands. Imagine trying to plan a military campaign when your soldiers have built-in expiration dates. Then there's the unpredictability factor. Feudal bonds made assembling large armies incredibly slow and frustrating. Lords might show up late because they had personal disputes to settle first. Others might arrive with fewer men than promised, claiming poor harvests or local troubles. Some didn't show up at all, sending excuses or hoping the king wouldn't notice their absence among thousands of other warriors. The whole system depended on personal relationships and honor codes that could shift depending on politics, family feuds, or simple inconvenience. A king might call for 10,000 men and end up with 6,000, or he might get lucky and receive more than expected when ambitious nobles saw an opportunity for glory and plunder. This feudal foundation created armies that were powerful but unreliable, filled with skilled fighters who had their own agendas and time limits. But what happened when knights alone weren't enough? Well, that's when medieval rulers had to get creative about filling their ranks with very different kinds of soldiers. When the knights had pledged their service, kings still faced a massive problem. 40 days of feudal obligation might get you a few hundred armored warriors, but medieval battles needed thousands of soldiers. That's where the common folk came in, whether they liked it or not. Village leaders across the kingdom received orders to produce men for war. These weren't volunteers stepping forward with patriotic speeches. Local officials walked through towns picking the youngest, poorest, or most expendable residents they could find. Makes sense, right? Nobody wanted to lose their best farmers during planting season. Enter the arrayers, royal officials who traveled from settlement to settlement like medieval talent scouts, except they were hunting for bodies, not skill. They'd arrive in a village, gather all the able-bodied men, and start making selections. Height mattered, age mattered, missing fingers or limbs definitely ruled you out. But the process was hardly scientific. Most peasants showed up carrying whatever they had. Pitchforks, clubs, maybe a rusty blade inherited from a grandfather. The wealthy brought spears or axes purchased from local blacksmiths. Don't expect shining armor, though. Leather jerkins and thick cloth had to suffice for protection. These weren't professional soldiers, they were farmers, bakers, and craftsmen suddenly thrust into military service. Then there's the timing factor that changed everything. Harvest season created an interesting dynamic. Before the crops came in, peasants often resisted recruitment. They needed to tend their fields. But after harvest, many volunteered willingly. Winter meant months of backbreaking labor or sitting idle. Military service offered escape, adventure, and regular meals. Plus, there was always the chance of looting enemy towns. The weird part is how village politics influenced military recruitment. Local disputes meant certain men got volunteered by neighbors who wanted them gone. Debts, family feuds, or simple dislike could land someone in the king's army. Some communities even held informal lotteries to decide who went to war. Peasant soldiers brought numbers that knights alone could never provide. A single county might contribute hundreds of foot soldiers to a royal campaign. They formed the backbone of medieval armies, the mass of humanity that absorbed enemy charges and overwhelmed defensive positions through sheer volume. But here's what made these common soldiers truly valuable. Desperation breeds fierce fighters. Peasants had little to lose and everything to gain from successful campaigns. They fought harder for their share of plunder than nobles fighting for honor. Yet assembling these massive peasant levies created new challenges for medieval commanders. Feeding, organizing, and motivating thousands of untrained civilians required resources and skills that went far beyond simply collecting warm bodies. When feudal knights weren't enough and peasants couldn't handle the job, medieval kings turned to professionals. Mercenaries didn't fight for honor or God. They fought for cold, hard cash. And they were expensive. These weren't desperate bandits looking for quick money. Professional mercenary companies ran like businesses, complete with contracts, equipment standards, and reputation management. The famous White Company in 14th century Italy employed over 3,000 men and operated across multiple countries. Their leader, John Hawkwood, became so wealthy he retired to a castle and married into nobility. But here's where it gets interesting. Mercenaries often possessed skills that local armies simply lacked. English kings hired Genoese crossbowmen because they could reload faster than anyone else. French rulers paid German pikemen because their formations could stop cavalry charges dead. Italian city-states recruited Swiss infantry because they fought with a discipline that feudal knights found impossible to match. The money involved was staggering. A single experienced mercenary captain might demand wages equivalent to what a skilled craftsman earned in 6 months. Multiply that by hundreds or thousands of soldiers, and royal treasuries emptied fast. Edward III spent roughly 60,000 pounds on mercenaries during just one campaign of the 100 Years' War, enough money to buy several towns. Then there's the loyalty problem. Mercenaries switched sides whenever someone offered better pay. The same German cavalry fighting for France in spring might join English ranks by autumn if the gold was right. Some mercenary captains played multiple sides simultaneously, collecting payments from different kings while avoiding actual combat. Smart business, terrible warfare. Payment methods varied wildly depending on circumstances. Some mercenaries demanded their full wages up front before marching. Others accepted land grants or captured loot as compensation. Many contracts included bonus payments for victories and penalties for desertion. The most successful mercenary companies negotiated complex deals that guaranteed payment even if campaigns failed. Royal accountants hated mercenary expenses, but kings kept hiring them anyway. Why? Because professional soldiers delivered results that amateur armies couldn't match. A company of veteran crossbowmen could break enemy formations in minutes. Experienced cavalry knew exactly when to charge and when to retreat. These weren't farm boys learning warfare on the job. The irony was obvious. Hiring mercenaries to fight your wars meant trusting foreigners who cared nothing about your kingdom's survival. But when facing enemies with their own professional armies, kings had little choice. Of course, money wasn't the only motivation drawing men to medieval armies. Some answered calls that promised something far more valuable than gold, and those spiritual rewards created the largest military movements in European history. When kings needed armies, they had one secret weapon that could move mountains: God himself. The Catholic Church didn't just pray for victory, they actively recruited soldiers by promising something no earthly king could offer: eternal salvation. Pope Urban II kicked this off in 1095 when he called the First Crusade. His speech was basically medieval marketing genius. Fight the infidels, reclaim the Holy Land, and boom, your sins are wiped clean. Plus, your family gets legal protection while you're gone, and your debts are frozen. Not a bad deal for swinging a sword. Bishops became recruitment officers, traveling from town to town preaching holy war. They'd set up in market squares and deliver fiery sermons about Christian duty and Muslim threats. The whole taking the cross ceremony was pure theater. Men would literally sew crosses onto their clothes, marking themselves as crusaders. Once you took that cross, backing out meant excommunication. Talk about commitment. But here's where it gets interesting. Not everyone joined for pure faith. Sure, some genuinely believed they were doing God's work. Others saw a golden opportunity for adventure, land, and loot. Younger sons with no inheritance, perfect crusade material, criminals looking to escape punishment. The cross offered amnesty. Peasants stuck in poverty. Holy war meant 3 meals a day and a chance at riches. The numbers were staggering. Over 100,000 people answered the First Crusade call. That's bigger than most medieval cities. They came from every social class: knights seeking glory, merchants hoping to establish trade routes, and countless peasants ready to trade their plows for swords. Religious motivation had serious staying power, too. While mercenaries might desert if payment stopped, and feudal knights could go home after 40 days, crusaders felt bound by divine obligation. They'd march through deserts, survive sieges, and keep fighting when any sane person would quit. Faith made them incredibly dangerous enemies. The church sweetened the deal further. Crusade veterans got special status back home, almost like medieval war heroes. They could tell stories in taverns for the rest of their lives. Some even got buried with their crosses, ensuring everyone knew they'd served God's army. Then there's the practical side bishops rarely mentioned. Crusading armies needed massive logistical support: food, weapons, horses, ships. The church collected donations, sold indulgences, and organized supply chains that would make modern corporations jealous. Religious calls created armies unlike anything else in medieval warfare. While other recruitment methods gathered reluctant soldiers or temporary fighters, faith built armies willing to die for their cause. But even the most motivated crusader needed proper equipment to survive battle. And that's where medieval economics got really expensive. Money talks, and in medieval warfare, it screamed. Knights didn't just wake up one morning with full suits of armor hanging in their closets like some kind of medieval superhero. That shiny metal protection cost more than most people's houses, literally. A complete set of plate armor could run the equivalent of a luxury car today, and that's before you factor in the horse, weapons, and all the fancy decorations that showed everyone exactly how rich you were. But here's where things get interesting. While Sir Fancy Pants was dropping a fortune on his gear, The average peasant soldier showed up with whatever he could scrape together from home. Farm tools doubled as weapons. Kitchen knives became daggers. That old wooden shield gathering dust in the barn, perfect for battle. Some poor souls literally brought pitchforks to sword fights. Lords tried to help by supplying basic weapons to their men, but even they had limits. Kings stepped in for the big-ticket items, uniforms that made their army look somewhat professional, and banners so everyone knew which side they were fighting for. Makes sense, right? You don't want your own troops accidentally attacking each other because nobody could tell who was who. Then there's the brutal math of medieval logistics. Army size wasn't determined by how many brave volunteers showed up. It was capped by cold, hard resources. Feed too many soldiers and your supply lines collapsed faster than a house of cards. Equip too few and you'd get crushed by better prepared enemies. Every king faced this impossible balancing act, trying to field the largest force his treasury could actually support. The numbers were staggering. A single campaign could drain half of a king's yearly income, and that's just for weapons and horses. Not food, not wages, not transportation, just the basic gear needed to fight. Some rulers literally bankrupted themselves trying to build armies big enough to win their wars. Edward III of England spent so much money on his French campaigns that he had to borrow from Italian bankers and pawn the crown jewels. Smart kings learned to be creative. They'd promise land grants instead of cash payments, offer captured loot as compensation, or strike deals with wealthy merchants who wanted royal protection for their trade routes. The weird part is how this financial juggling act often determined battle outcomes before anyone even drew their sword. But having all the best equipment meant nothing if your soldiers didn't know how to use it properly. Getting an army together was just the beginning. Now came the terrifying reality. Most of these people had no idea how to fight as a group. Sure, knights had been swinging swords since they could walk, but your average peasant? He'd probably never held anything sharper than a kitchen knife. Knights lived for this stuff. They practiced daily with real weapons, not wooden toys, but actual steel that could split a man in half. Tournaments weren't just fancy entertainment for nobles. They were brutal training sessions where knights learned to fight on horseback, handle multiple opponents, and stay calm when someone's trying to cave your skull in. The smart ones treated every tournament like a dress rehearsal for war. Then there were the archers. English longbowmen started training as children, pulling lighter bows until their muscles developed. By adulthood, they could shoot 12 arrows per minute with deadly accuracy. Their arm bones actually grew thicker from the constant strain. Archaeological evidence shows English archers had enlarged left arm bones and twisted spines from decades of drawing those massive bows. Talk about dedication to your craft. But here's where things got messy. While knights and archers knew their business, armies also included thousands of complete beginners. Peasants who'd spent their lives plowing fields suddenly found themselves holding spears, trying to learn basic formations in a matter of weeks. Drill camps became crash courses in not getting yourself or your neighbors killed. Mock battles sorted the wheat from the chaff pretty quickly. Lords would stage practice fights to test tactics and see who could actually follow orders under pressure. The weak-hearted usually revealed themselves when faced with charging cavalry, even if it was just practice. Better to find out during training than when enemy steel was inches from your face. Some soldiers brought zero experience to the table. Others were grizzled veterans who'd survived dozens of battles and knew every trick in the book. This created a bizarre mix. Seasoned killers fighting alongside farmers who'd never seen blood outside of slaughtering pigs. The experienced men became informal teachers, showing newcomers how to hold shields, when to advance, and most importantly, when to run. Training camps buzzed with activity. Men practiced marching in formation, learning to move as one massive unit rather than a chaotic mob. They drilled with weapons, studied basic battlefield signals, and tried to develop the muscle memory that might save their lives when fear took over. The question wasn't whether they'd learned enough, it was whether they'd learned enough fast enough. Because once this army started moving toward enemy territory, there'd be no more practice rounds. Money makes armies move, but keeping them loyal? That's where medieval kings turned into master manipulators and desperate accountants rolled into one. Every successful war campaign started with one brutal truth. Soldiers who don't get paid don't fight. Well, they might fight against you. Kings squeezed coins from every possible source. Nobles faced hefty taxes on their lands. Merchants watched their profits disappear into royal coffers. Towns handed over chunks of their treasury just to avoid having soldiers stationed permanently in their streets. The wealthy church, even bishops couldn't escape contributing to God's wars. But here's the weird part. Sometimes kings borrowed so much money that winning the war became secondary to just paying back debts. Smart rulers knew that loyalty couldn't survive on promises alone. They showered their best generals with gifts, fine horses, jeweled swords, maybe a castle or two. Knights received bonuses for exceptional bravery. Even common soldiers got their share of captured enemy weapons and armor. Victory meant everyone prospered together. Then there's the darker side of medieval motivation. Desert your post? Expect a public flogging at minimum. Refuse the king's call to arms completely? You risked losing your lands, facing imprisonment, or dangling from a rope. Medieval justice didn't mess around with military obligations. Lords who failed to provide their promised troops faced royal wrath that could destroy entire family fortunes. But the real challenge was managing personalities and egos during actual campaigns. Generals plotted against each other constantly. Rival nobles used military service as opportunities to settle old feuds. Kings walked tightropes, balancing competing interests while trying to focus everyone on the actual enemy. Famous betrayals haunted every throne room. Edward II learned this lesson fatally when his own barons turned against him. Victory created its own problems, too. Successful armies expected generous rewards, and soldiers grew accustomed to regular loot. Peasant recruits who survived battles returned home with new expectations and often refused to go back to simple farming. Knights developed expensive tastes for foreign wines and silks. The smartest medieval rulers understood that armies were temporary partnerships held together by mutual benefit. Keep the money flowing, share the spoils fairly, and punish disloyalty swiftly. That formula worked for centuries. Lose control of any single element, and entire campaigns collapsed from within. Managing medieval armies required equal parts accountant, psychologist, and tyrant. Kings who mastered this balance built empires. Those who failed found themselves facing their own soldiers across battlefield lines, learning too late that loyalty truly was the most expensive weapon of all.